It was a Wednesday morning, like countless others I've spent on the bench. The air in the courtroom had that familiar mixture of tension and routine. Defendants clutching tickets, lawyers flipping through files, the quiet hum of people waiting for justice to unfold. I always say, every case that comes before me carries a story. Some are simple, some heartbreaking, and some, like the one I'm about to tell you, serve as reminders of why respect is worth more than any fortune. That morning, the clerk called the next case a Marcus Wellington, reckless driving and failure to comply with police commands. When the doors opened, the atmosphere changed immediately. You could feel it. A man walked in as though he owned the ground beneath him. Perfectly tailored suit. I'd say at least $3,000. Gleaming watch. Custom Italian shoes that reflected the overhead lights. Everything about him screamed one word: power. He wasn't nervous, not even remotely. He was annoyed, inconvenienced, as if the mere act of being summoned to my courtroom was beneath him. He approached the podium not with humility, but with the confidence of someone used to boardrooms, not courtrooms. His chin was slightly raised, his eyes scanning the room like he was assessing a business deal. I've seen that look before. The look of a man who spent so long giving orders that he's forgotten how to listen. Good morning, Mr. Wellington, I greeted, as I do with everyone who stands before me. He barely glanced at me. Good morning, he said. No, Your Honor. No respect. Just a word tossed out like a formality. Now, I've learned over decades that the way a person greets you often tells you everything you need to know about how the rest of the hearing will go. And from that single word, I knew this case wasn't about a speeding ticket. It was about something much deeper. I reviewed the report. Wellington, you're cited for reckless driving on Benefit Street. The officer's notes say you were traveling 68 miles per hour in a 25-mile zone. That's nearly triple the limit in a residential neighborhood. He exhaled loudly, visibly impatient. I was late for a board meeting, he said. The street was clear. Nobody was in danger. Now I've heard every excuse in the book, from broken speedometers to invisible dogs in the road. But arrogance is always the hardest one to reason with. I continued. The report also says there were pedestrians present, including a woman who had to step back with her dog to avoid being struck. The report exaggerates, he said, waving his hand dismissively. People weren't paying attention. I had control of my vehicle. Control? That word hung in the air. People like Marcus love control. They thrive on it. They need it. But in that moment, he didn't realize that in this courtroom, control wasn't his to hold. I asked Mr. Wellington, it says you didn't stop for 6 blocks after the officer activated his lights. Why didn't you pull over immediately? He smirked. I was looking for a convenient place to stop. I wasn't going to pull over in the middle of traffic. E6 blocks is a long search for convenience, I replied. He shrugged, leaning casually on the podium, as though we were discussing a minor inconvenience. That casualness, that carelessness, spoke volumes. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't sorry. He was calculating how quickly he could get this over with and go back to his world of power and privilege. Then came the moment that told me exactly who I was dealing with. When I asked about his refusal to hand over his license to the officer, he smirked again and said, I was in the middle of an important call. The officer could wait 2 minutes. The courtroom murmured quietly. The audacity of it, to tell an officer to wait until his business call ended, wasn't just arrogance. It was contempt disguised as importance. And Mr. Wellington, I said, keeping my voice calm, do you believe your time is more valuable than the safety of others? He didn't hesitate. Your Honor, do you know who I am? I looked at him for a long moment. I've heard those words before, but every time they carry the same hollow pride. Yes, I replied. You're Marcus Wellington, and you're here for reckless driving. Beyond that, I don't see how your identity is relevant. That's when his smile faltered just slightly. He wasn't used to being told that his name, his wealth, his title meant nothing. Your Honor, he said, leaning forward as if to reassert his dominance. I'm the CEO of TechVanguard Systems. We employ hundreds of people here. We contribute millions to the local economy. I think my position is very relevant. I nodded slowly, In this courtroom, Mr. Wellington, your position is as relevant as anyone else's job, which is to say, not at all. We're here to address your actions, not your resume. You could feel the tension ripple through the courtroom. He wasn't just angry now. He was offended. He wasn't used to equality. To him, equality felt like disrespect. Yes, I continued reading through the report. I could sense him seething beside the podium. His jaw was tight, his hand gripping the edge. He thought money was power, and he assumed that power carried into every room he entered. But there's one place where money means nothing, a courtroom where truth and justice take precedence. And as I looked at him, this man dressed in power, surrounded by people who would never see his kind of wealth, I realized something. Arrogance doesn't just blind people to their actions. It convinces them they're untouchable. He came to my courtroom expecting a quick fine and a short lecture. What he didn't know was that before the day was done, his arrogance would cost him everything, his license, his career, and his reputation. I leaned back, folded my hands, and said quietly, Mr. Wellington, I want you to understand something. In this room, your wealth doesn't matter. And that ain't. Your title doesn't matter. What matters is respect for the law, for others, and for yourself. And right then I saw the first flicker of something in his eyes. Not humility yet, but disbelief. Because for the first time in a long time, Marcus Wellington was facing someone he couldn't buy, intimidate, or outtalk. And that's where this story truly begins. After hearing Marcus Wellington's opening remarks, I had a feeling we weren't just dealing with a traffic violation. We were dealing with something much bigger. A man whose ego had long replaced his conscience. You see, in my courtroom, I've met all kinds of people. The nervous, the remorseful, the frustrated, but arrogance is different. It walks in wearing confidence like armor and leaves blind to its own cracks. I turned to the clerk and asked for the dashcam footage from the officer's patrol car. Now let's take a look at what really happened that morning, I said, making sure Marcus could see the monitor clearly. The footage began to play. The scene unfolded like a movie. A quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, the kind of street where children ride bicycles and elderly neighbors walk their dogs. Then, from the corner of the frame came a flash of silver. It sped past the patrol vehicle so fast that even on camera it was just a blur. 68 miles an hour, the officer's voice crackled through the video. In a 25 zone, I could hear the collective murmur of disbelief ripple through the courtroom. Parents, retirees, everyday citizens, all watching a man who thought he was above the rules they lived by. Marcus, however, looked unfazed. In fact, he smiled. That was taken out of context, he said. A context? He said. A context? I asked, raising an eye. It looks quite straightforward to me. He crossed his arms as if preparing to explain a business mistake to a boardroom. Your Honor, the camera exaggerates speed. Anyone who's driven nose perspective can make it look faster than it is. I leaned forward. Mr. Wellington, the radar clocked your speed. The numbers don't depend on perspective. He smirked. Radar isn't always accurate either. You'd be surprised how often technology fails, and I happen to know a little something about that. He was trying to charm me now, appeal to authority through arrogance. It's a tactic I've seen before. When caught, deflect. When confronted, condescend. But I wasn't there to argue. I was there to make him see himself for who he truly was. We saw the patrol lights flash, the siren wail, and Marcus's car continue forward, ignoring it for nearly 6 city blocks. Cars pulled aside, pedestrians turned to look. The officer, calm but persistent, followed until Marcus finally rolled to a stop in front of a cafe, not because it was safe, but because it was convenient. When the officer approached his window, the audio captured Marcus's voice perfectly. Cool, dismissive, and dripping with superiority. I'll be with you in a minute, he said. I'm on a call. The officer waited. 30 seconds, then 60, then 90. Sir, I need you to hang up and provide your license. Marcus waved him off. I said a minute. I stopped the video right there. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel strike I've ever delivered. Mr. Wellington, I said slowly, you were told to pull over immediately, and you didn't. You were told to hand over your license, and you didn't. That's not an error of technology. That's a choice. He shifted in place, the first hint of discomfort flickering in his eyes. It wasn't intentional disrespect, he muttered. I was handling a deal worth millions at that moment. I couldn't just hang up. The millions? I repeated softly. Tell me, Mr. Wellington, what's the price of a human life? Because that's what could have been lost on that street. He didn't answer. His lips pressed into a tight line. I continued. You say your call was important. The officer's duty was to protect people who were just walking their dogs, crossing the street, or taking their kids to school. Their safety isn't less important than your schedule. He let out a short laugh, not of amusement, but disbelief. Oh, come on, Judge. I wasn't going to hit anyone. I've driven for decades without an accident. I looked at him quietly. There's a difference between skill and responsibility, Mr. Wellington. Skill means you can control a car. Responsibility means you choose to slow down when others can't control what you do. That's when his expression shifted. For the first time, he looked frustrated, not because I was wrong, but because I wasn't giving him what he wanted. Difference. He wasn't used to losing control of a situation. In my years on the bench, I've learned that ego often grows in silence. When people aren't told no often enough, they start to believe they're always right. And Marcus had lived a lifetime of yes. His assistants, his board members, his colleagues, they all reinforced the illusion that his way was the only way. But justice doesn't operate on personal terms. Oh, I decided to show him one more thing. Let's listen to the officer's final remarks. The officer's voice filled the room. A driver was uncooperative, refused to provide license immediately. Expressed entitlement based on wealth and position. Stated, quote, I don't take orders from anyone, especially not from someone making $40,000 a year. A collective gasp moved through the gallery. Marcus looked down, perhaps realizing that hearing your own arrogance aloud hits differently when there's nowhere left to hide. I paused. Will you say that, Mr. Wellington? He hesitated, then muttered. I might have said something like that in frustration. I nodded. You see, that's the thing about frustration. It doesn't create character. It reveals it. The courtroom was silent again. I faced defendants who couldn't afford bus fare, and they stood there trembling, praying for leniency. Then there was this man who had everything, yet lacked the simplest virtue, humility. I looked him in the eye and said, Mr. Wellington, this court isn't here to humiliate you. It's here to remind you that laws don't bend for wealth, and respect isn't optional. You broke the law and you disrespected an officer in the process. That's not just reckless driving, that's reckless ego. He tried to speak, but I held up my hand. I'll hear you after I finish. You'll have your turn, but not until you've heard mine. His jaw tightened. That silence, that moment where he couldn't control the floor, was probably the longest silence he'd endured in years. And though he didn't know it yet, that silence was the beginning of his unraveling. Because when arrogance meets accountability, the noise always fades, and the truth finally has room to speak. I've been on the bench for many years, and I've learned that the courtroom can be a mirror. It reflects exactly who we are when the shield of pretense falls away. Some people see their reflection and feel remorse. Others, they see it and double down on pride. Marcus Wellington was about to do the latter. After the dashcam footage ended, the room was thick with tension. You could feel the collective disbelief, like the air itself was holding its breath. I looked over at Marcus. Most people in his position would have softened by now, apologized, maybe even looked ashamed, but not Marcus. He leaned back, one hand in his pocket, that same faint smirk resting on his face like it was carved there. I folded my hands on the bench. Mister Wellington, do you have anything you wish to say before I continue? He adjusted his tie and said, Yes, Your Honor. I think this entire situation has been blown completely out of proportion. The courtroom murmured again. I could sense the growing disbelief from the audience. Regular people who just watched him drive through a neighborhood like it was a racetrack. A blown out of proportion? I repeated, You were traveling nearly 70 in a residential zone. And yet you think this is exaggerated? He shrugged. I think context matters. I wasn't driving through rush hour traffic. It was early morning. The road was clear, and I raised my hand to stop him. Let me ask you something, Mr. Wellington. If a child had run out chasing a ball that morning, what would you have done? He hesitated. Just for a moment. I would have stopped, he said quickly. At 68 miles per hour? Asked quietly. The physics says otherwise. He looked away, annoyed, as though facts were an inconvenience. That's when I knew he wasn't here to take responsibility. He was here to win. Mr. Wellington, I continued, you've made it clear that you believe your position gives you certain privileges. You've mentioned your company, your employees, your salary. But let me be clear, none of that matters here. In this courtroom, everyone stands on the same floor. He gave a short, condescending laugh. With all due respect, Your Honor, that's a nice sentiment, but it's not true. People with influence always get treated differently, for better or worse. I'm just being honest about how the world works. It was that phrase, I'm just being honest, that revealed everything. The problem wasn't ignorance. It was conviction. He truly believed his own version of fairness. Perhaps in your world that's how it works, I said evenly, but not in mine. Not here. That's when the mask slipped. I could see it, a flash of irritation breaking through the corporate polish. He leaned forward, his tone sharpening. Your Honor, do you know who I am? Do you know who I am? Ah, there it was, the phrase that marks the fall of many proud men. Yes, Mr. Wellington, I said calmly. You're the individual charged with reckless driving, failure to obey police orders, and now possibly contempt of court. That's who you are here. He chuckled, incredulous. A contempt? For what? Telling the truth. For your attitude, I replied, keeping my tone measured. For the belief that this court is beneath you. He scoffed. I built $1 billion company, Judge. I make decisions that affect thousands of people. I don't need a lecture about humility from someone who's never... That's when I cut him off. Mr. Wellington, I've presided over this court for decades. I've heard from people who've lost everything and still managed to speak with grace. I've seen single mothers break down because they couldn't afford a parking ticket, and they still called me Your Honor. You can't even bring yourself to show basic decency. The courtroom went still. Even Marcus's arrogance faltered for a moment, just a flicker, before his jaw tightened again. He muttered, You're being overly sensitive. Overly sensitive. Those words carried the weight of every entitled person who's ever believed they were above consequence. I felt the heat rise in the room. The officers, the gallery, everyone could feel it. Mr. Wellington, I said slowly, let me offer you a piece of advice. When you find yourself standing before the law, humility isn't weakness. It's wisdom. You'd be wise to remember that before you speak again. He rolled his eyes in open court. And then, in one reckless, prideful moment, he sealed his own fate. He raised his hand and extended his middle finger at me. Right there, in front of the cameras, the officers, the spectators, everyone, you could hear the collective gasp. One woman covered her mouth. The bailiff stepped forward instinctively, unsure whether to intervene. I stood frozen for half a second, not in shock, but in disbelief that a grown man of his stature would go that far. Mr. Wellington, I said, my voice steady but sharp as steel. Did you just make an obscene gesture toward this court? He leaned back, smirking. Oh, yeah, he said. What are you going to do about it? What I felt in that moment wasn't anger. It was disappointment. Disappointment that someone could achieve so much and yet learn so little about dignity. I straightened my robe and looked him dead in the eye. What am I going to do? I repeated softly. I'm going to remind you and everyone watching that no one is above the law. The bailiff stepped closer, ready for instruction. The courtroom was silent now, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself was waiting for the gavel to fall. Mr. Wellington, I said, my tone low and deliberate, you've crossed the line from arrogance into contempt. And now we proceed accordingly. He didn't realize it then, but in that single defiant gesture, that one raised finger, Marcus Wellington's empire began to crumble. Because while money can buy luxury, it cannot buy respect. And in my courtroom, respect is the only currency that truly matters. When Marcus Wellington raised that middle finger in my courtroom, time seemed to stop. I've seen anger before, frustration, tears, even rage. But this wasn't emotion. This was contempt born from entitlement. It wasn't about me, not really. It was about what I represented, a system he couldn't buy, manipulate, or intimidate. For a moment, I simply looked at him. No words, no movement, just silence. The entire courtroom waited for my reaction. Officers standing alert, citizens frozen in disbelief, and Marcus still wearing that smug expression, like he had just won something. Then I stood up. In my courtroom, that means something. When I rise, it's because I need the person before me to understand that this is no longer a conversation. It's judgment. The room went dead quiet. Mr. Wellington, I said slowly, you have just demonstrated the clearest possible example of contempt I've seen in years. He shifted slightly, realizing he might have gone too far. Your Honor, I don't speak. You've said enough. I could feel every eye in that courtroom focused on me, waiting for what came next. I've learned over the years that authority isn't about how loudly you raise your voice. It's about how firmly you stand your ground. You came into this courtroom with arrogance. You believed your wealth and title placed you above accountability. You ignored the law and disrespected law enforcement. And now you've shown contempt for this court. There are people who walk in here terrified because they can't afford a $100 fine, and yet they treat this court with dignity. You, on the other hand, have treated it like an inconvenience. He scoffed, still trying to maintain composure. This is ridiculous. I've already offered to pay the fine. Mr. Wellington? I said, my tone now cold and deliberate. This isn't about money. This is about respect for the law, for the lives you endangered, and for the principle that no one is above either. He crossed his arm. You're making a spectacle out of this. Sir, I replied, you made a spectacle when you flipped off this bench? You could feel the words land like a gavel strike. Even Marcus seemed to deflate slightly. I turned to the clerk. Record this for reckless driving at 70 miles per hour in the 25 zone, maximum fine $2,500. For failure to comply with police commands, additional $1,000. Marcus barely reacted. He thought money was his armor. But he wasn't ready for what came next. I feel contempt of court, I continued. I thought your obscene gesture and utter disrespect to this institution. An additional $5,000 fine. That brings your total to $8,500. He shrugged like he was paying for valet service. I'll have my assistant send a check. I leaned forward slightly. Slightly. We're not finished. Now he looked uneasy. Or driver's license suspended for 6 months effective immediately, I said. You'll surrender it to the bailiff before you leave. Is com cracked? 6 months? Your Honor, that's... I raised a hand. Don't interrupt me again. He went silent. You will also complete 50 hours of community service, specifically with the Youth Traffic Safety Program. You'll stand in front of teenagers and explain what happens when arrogance meets a steering wheel. He started shaking his head. You don't have time for that? You'll make time, I said firmly. And that's not all. You'll attend an 8-week traffic safety course every Saturday morning. You miss one session and your suspension becomes a year. The courtroom was utterly still. Even the reporters in the back had stopped writing, just listening. Marcus looked pale now. The realization was setting in. This wasn't going away quietly. But I wasn't. A dash cam footage of your reckless driving, I continued, along with this courtroom proceeding, will be submitted to the Providence Police Department's Public Safety Division as an educational example of what reckless disregard looks like. That's when Marcus finally lost composure. You can't do that. That's my image, my reputation. Your reputation? I interrupted. Mr. Wellington, you built your reputation and now you've destroyed it. All on your own. I could see him trying to breathe through his anger. Jaw tight, eyes darting toward the door like he wanted to leave. But I wasn't done yet. Then one final order, I said, my tone lower now. Calm but sharp enough to cut through his pride. I'm forwarding this footage to the Rhode Island Business Licensing Board and to your company's Corporate Ethics Division. While I cannot determine your employment, I can ensure those responsible for your company's integrity are aware of your actions. That hit him like a physical blow. For the first time since he walked in, Marcus Wellington looked afraid. You can't, he started. I can, I said simply, and I will. He stared at me, silent now, the kind of silence that comes when a man finally realizes his wealth can't shield him. I looked him directly in the eye. You asked me if I knew who you are, Mr. Wellington. I do. You're someone who thought privilege meant permission. You're someone who thought rules were for others. But today you learned something important, that your position doesn't elevate you above consequence. It only amplifies the damage when you fall. He stood there, pale, hands trembling slightly. Your Honor, I'll appeal this. Appeal all you want, I said, my voice steady. The record speaks for itself. The evidence is clear. The contempt was witnessed by everyone in this. I paused, letting the weight of it settle. Mr. Wellington, you're dismissed. Surrender your license to the bailiff before you leave." He turned, no longer strutting, just walking quickly, almost stumbling, trying to escape the cameras that had recorded every second of his collapse. And as the door closed behind him, I looked around the courtroom. No one spoke. Every person there just watched arrogance unravel in real time, and justice hold its ground. What happened next would echo far beyond my courtroom walls. Because when pride meets accountability, the impact doesn't stop at the gavel. It ripples outward into boardrooms, headlines, and the lives of everyone who once believed themselves untouchable. Marcus Wellington was about to learn that lesson the hard way. When Marcus Wellington left my courtroom that morning, the story could have ended there. A reckless driver fined, a license suspended, a lesson, hopefully, learned. But arrogance, when it collapses, never does so quietly. It makes noise. It draws attention. And in this age of cameras, that noise travels farther than ever before. By the time I returned to my chambers, the clip of Marcus's outburst, the attitude, the ruling, was already making its way online. A courtroom visitor had posted a short video, and within hours, it spread across social media like wildfire. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. A CEO, a man of wealth and influence, standing in front of a judge, mocking the law as though it were beneath him. And then that single gesture. It was replayed, analyzed, memed, and debated. Every news outlet picked it up by nightfall. By the next morning, Marcus Wellington was no longer a CEO. He was a headline. A tech executive gives judge the finger and pays the price, i.e. $2. $4 million CEO learns $8,500 lesson in respect, and perhaps the most pointed one of all. But no one is above the law. Judge Frank Caprio reminds us why. Now, I didn't take pleasure in seeing his humiliation. That's never the goal. My job has never been to destroy. It's to correct. But sometimes correction arrives in the form of consequence. 2 days after the ruling, there was a knock on my chamber door. My clerk told me a visitor from TechVanguard Systems wanted to speak privately. A woman entered, mid-50s, professional, composed, but with a kind of weariness behind her eyes. "Your Honor," she said, "I'm Janet Morrison, chair of the board at TechVanguard." She took a deep breath before continuing. "Well, I came to inform you that as of this morning, Marcus Wellington has been terminated from his position as CEO." I nodded, not surprised, but not triumphant either. "Yeah, Miss Morrison, I take no satisfaction in that. But I imagine your decision wasn't easy." She smiled faintly. "It wasn't. We built this company on innovation and integrity. And yet, in one afternoon, Marcus managed to undo years of reputation. Our investors were calling within hours. Our employees were demoralized. We had no choice but to act. I asked her quietly, 'What happens to the people who work for him?' 'They'll be fine,' she said firmly. We're promoting from within, someone with humility and vision, someone who understands that leadership isn't a privilege. It's a responsibility." There was a pause. She looked at me thoughtfully. We're also creating a new corporate ethics initiative, workshops on accountability, respect, community safety. We were calling it the Wellington Accountability Program. But I couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. They're named after him. "Yes," she said with a touch of irony. So his failure becomes our reminder. She stood, thanked me, and left. And as the door closed behind her, I found myself thinking about how poetic that was, that even in disgrace, a man's downfall could plant the seed of integrity for others. Later that day, as I walked through the courthouse hallway, an older gentleman approached me. He was in his 70s, well-dressed, dignified. "Judge Caprio," he said, shaking my hand, "I was in your courtroom when you ruled against that man. I wanted to thank you." I smiled politely. "Thank me?" "For what, sir?" he said. For reminding people that success doesn't make you special. Character does. I spent 40 years in business. Men like that, they give honest, hard-working people a bad name. They think money buys immunity. You showed him it does." I looked him in the eye and said something I truly believed. "Sir, I didn't destroy his career. He did that himself. I just made sure there were consequences." He nodded, his expression softening. "Sometimes that's exactly what people need to see." He was right. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about exposure. It's about holding up a mirror so that others can see the reflection and think twice before walking the same path. Over the following week, the story kept spreading. Marcus tried to release a statement, something about misunderstanding, about stress and unfair treatment, but the public wasn't buying it. His apology felt hollow because humility, when it's forced, always does. His company moved on. His board replaced him. His license remained suspended. But perhaps the biggest loss was image, the one he'd built so carefully over years of power. Now, when people thought of Marcus Wellington, they didn't see a billionaire CEO. They saw a man in a courtroom, flipping off a judge, and losing everything. I never spoke to Marcus again after that day, but I truly hope, that somewhere in the quiet after the storm, he understood. That he realized respect isn't something you demand with status or wealth. It's something you earn through grace, humility, and how you treat others, especially when the world is watching. Because at the end of it all, that's what justice is meant to do. Remind us of our shared humanity. Whether you're a janitor or a CEO, the law isn't a wall that separates us. It's a line that keeps us equal. As I often say to people who stand before me, the courtroom doesn't measure your money. It measures your behavior. And on that day, behavior was all that mattered. Marcus Wellington walked into my courtroom believing he was untouchable. He walked out a different man, not because I wanted to humble him, but because the truth did. And if there's one lesson his story leaves behind, it's this. Respect costs nothing, but disrespect can cost you everything.